Well, One Life Henderson and One Life West and One Life East, I want to begin by just wishing everybody a very sincere Merry Christmas to all of you. And I mean that. I'm so glad that you spent this time with us as we have our Christmas communion service today. I'd like to also give a sincere happy birthday to my mom, because I love my mom and she deserves that. And I hope she has a wonderful day as well. As I was thinking back on my childhood, Mom and Dad did a great job with the Christmas thing. They really did. And as I look back, I was thinking about this past week. I was looking back, like, man, Christmases were an awesome time for our family. And I think one of the main things that I loved about Christmas was the anticipation of it. You remember that as a kid? I mean, I don't know if they still do this or not. This is kind of one of those back in my day, boys and girls things. But construction paper chains, do they still make those? You remember cutting the strips of construction paper and you make a little chain, you link it together. And there was a couple of my grade school teachers made those, and they used it as a countdown to Christmas. And I can still remember that as a kid. It's like, it seemed like, just impossibly long at the beginning, and then they tore one off each day, and you're leading up to it and you're watching it go. Because Christmas was this time that, most importantly, at least for me, never disappointed. I look forward to it every year because it was never a letdown. And I feel kind of guilty saying that, because there has to be people out there that it was kind of a disappointment for you. But it wasn't for me. And so thanks, Mom. I appreciate that. And even more, happy birthday, right? And so what we've been doing for the last several weeks, we started the first Sunday in November. We've been in this series called Shadows. And what we've been doing is anticipating Christmas the way the Bible anticipates Christmas. It's called the 39 books of what we collectively know as the Old Testament. Because Jesus himself said that all of those books back there, they're filled with events and people, even physical objects and experiences, that all of those things, according to him, ultimately pointed to him. They're all about him. So what we did is we went back and explored how that worked. And hopefully, and those of you that haven't been with us, I encourage you to go back and listen to that because of a few reasons. First of all, I hope for anybody that hears it, that it encourages their faith in a way that kind of says, this thing just might be supernatural. The Bible might just not be a book that's filled with weird stories. When you go back and you look at the Old Testament way of doing things, you see Jesus foreshadowed. And so it raises its intellectual credibility, but it also raises the sense of God must be writing this thing. But here's the other thing that it does, or hopefully it's done for you, is that it reminds us that Jesus is the point of the Bible. We say Jesus is the reason for the season. Well, he's the reason for all of history according to the Bible. Everything was leading up to him. But not only that, thirdly, what it does is it really helped us and reminded us, hopefully, of what it was about Jesus. I like to say, never generic Jesus. I hear people say, Jesus is the reason for the season. I always want to kind of respond to, what do you mean by that? What about Jesus? Is it that Jesus kind of came on the world and said, a nice guy is here bringing peace on earth, and that's it? Is that what it's for? Or was Jesus sent to do something specific? Well, what we're going to do today is we're going to go to one more shadow passage from the Old Testament. You heard it in kind of a cool little artful video form a little while ago. And I want you to see the Christmas story through the grid of this shadow. As a matter of fact, this shadow is so vivid in its description of who Jesus is and his life that it's not really even a shadow. It's really like the light thing itself. And you have to keep in mind something before we read it. First of all, to raise the intellectual credibility, you have to remember that what we're about to read and study was written 650 years before Jesus was ever born and placed in that manger. 650 years. To put that in perspective, our country signed our Declaration of Independence from Britain in 1776. It was 242 years ago. Think about that, 242 years. All of our history, so George Washington, the Civil War, and World War II, and all the things that have come with it, all of our history has been packed into 242 years. Add 400 years on top of that, and you get to 650 years, okay? And that takes you all the way back to if you were to do that, from now, going back 650 years, you'd go all the way back to the year 1398. You know what happened in 1398? Neither do I. And that's the point. Because it was so far back there, most of us are like, wasn't that Braveheart or something like that? Or Game of Thrones was happening back there, people riding horses and doing spears and stuff. That's it, that's all. But imagine, think about it in your mind. Someone back in 1398 were to write something down that this year that you and I could know for sure was a vivid picture of something that happened just now, we would think this has a supernatural quality. As a matter of fact, the passage that we're going to be looking at today has been considered by some skeptics through the centuries as a forgery. Oh, Christians came along after and just kind of wrote Jesus in to the book of Isaiah. And that they could kind of make a case for that originally all the way up until 1947. In 1947, two Bedouin shepherds, and when I say that, I was able to visit Israel and Afghanistan, and I have been in the camps of Bedouin shepherds 2 different times in those places. They still exist today, and it's like stepping back 3,000 years. There's guys in the robes, they wear they ride the camels, they herd sheep. I mean, you really feel like you're going back in time. They wander around the countryside doing that. Well, a couple of those guys back in Israel, 1947. Sheep kind of got lost, and they went out looking for him. And they went to this area, I want to picture it up here, area near the Dead Sea that had caves in it. Okay, there it is, okay. There was an awkward silence that, trust me, I felt more awkward than any of you, okay? So there's caves like that, and so they went crawling around up there looking for the sheep, and before they went in one of the caves, they thought maybe he's in there, they threw a rock in there just to see kind of what, does it have a bottom, before we go in, and they heard a cracking noise. And they crawled in there, and they found several empty pots that looked very, very old. And then as they went through them, they found one that wasn't empty. And it had inside it a scroll. And they had made one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the history of archaeology, what you know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's a lot of things about the Dead Sea Scrolls that you need to know, but the most important thing you need to know, well, one of the things you need to know is one scholar said they're really not the Dead Sea Scrolls as much as they are the Dead Sea confetti. And what that means is they're so fragile that they're actually in little bitty pieces, but they found over 900 different scrolls and manuscripts and things around at the Dead Sea, but they found one that was in better condition than any of them. It's called the Great Isaiah Scroll. And it's on display in a museum to this day. You can go to Israel. I've seen it there in person, at least a facsimile of the exact thing. And I've seen that Isaiah 53 was there. And the reason that's so significant is because scholars know through forensics and everything else that those scrolls were written down at a minimum of 100 years before Jesus ever showed up on the scene. And that's important to note. So it kind of did away with this whole thing of, Christians came in later and wrote this passage down that we see. And that's where we're going to pick up. We're going to pick up in Isaiah, actually chapter 52, and read forward this prophecy, this picture, this foreshadowing of Jesus. And look at what it has to tell us about him and the Christmas story. It says this, "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up, highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness." Now, the first thing I want you to see in that passage and today, when it comes to this prophecy, this foreshadowing, is exaltation through humiliation. Exaltation through humiliation. Basically, the first thing out of the gate, it says what's going to be characteristic of Jesus is that he's going to be highly exalted. He's going to be highly exalted, but it's going to come through the vehicle of being marred beyond human recognition. That's a picture of the cross, that he was so beaten and so bruised. If you saw the movie, The Passion of the Christ, you got to feel for this. He was so beaten and bruised, and the crown of thorns, and that he looked like he wasn't even human when he was hanging there, but that was going to add up to the highest exaltation you could get. Now think about this. And today is proof of this throughout the world. Throughout the world, Sundays all over, in churches everywhere, the name of Jesus is being celebrated 2,000 years later. And no matter what you happen to believe about him, you can at least acknowledge that Jesus himself is truly the most exalted personality in all of history. Everybody knows that. I mean, it's undisputed. Who else would it be if it wasn't him? He's respected. He's looked to, even the people that don't believe he's the Son of God or any of that kind of thing. Jesus' birthday is being celebrated, and everybody knows that Christmas is everybody's, most people's favorite holiday as well. We celebrate it all over. Christianity is exploding in the country of China as we speak, even though its own government is persecuting it. In South America, it's expanding like crazy. In Africa as well. Truly all over the world. Think about that for a second. It's something we take for granted. But 650 years before Jesus ever appeared on the scene, He said, the most exalted. He's going to be exalted highly, but it's going to happen through humiliation. Someone who is going to go down as far as you can go is going to be raised up as high as you can get. And that's something you and I need to remember, that when we're his followers, in a world that celebrates everything from popularity and Facebook likes and all the rest, that we need to remember that what God is truly impressed by is someone just bows the knee to him and walks out the path no matter what it is and waits for that future glory. Now, the second thing I want you to observe about this is rejection. Rejection. It picks up in Isaiah chapter 53, beginning at verse 1. This is all part of one thing, by the way. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Now, I want you to know that what some scholars have noted, that first of all, this is done in kind of a past tense form, this shadow. It's this prophecy that's projecting into the future, but it's not just predicting that Jesus is going to come and he's going to do what he's going to do. It's put in the form of going beyond that and looking back. And there are some who believe that this is the collective nation of Israel who, as a collective, have rejected Jesus as the Messiah. But the Bible says that there's going to be a day when they won't, that they're going to receive him. And it's viewed as a prayer looking back. We didn't esteem him. He showed up and we're hurting because we just simply didn't recognize him as the Messiah. And some of it came down to very practical things. There was nothing in his appearance to attract us to him. You ever had this experience before, whether you've read a book or listened to radio or a podcast or something like that, and you just heard someone's voice or read their words, but then you saw them in person and you're like, oh, that's not at all what I pictured. I can do that little act there because I had that happen to, there was an author, I won't mention who it was, but an author I love, just really took it in. And I went to a conference where he was there live and he walked out on the stage. I was like, okay, well, I didn't see, I don't know, it's not fair to say, that your words could match your looks or whatever in your mind, but I just had that. There was several years ago, I've showed this before, but I want you to see it again. Several years ago, there was a group of scholars who did a composite way of trying to reconstruct what Jesus, or at least the average Galilean from his day, might have looked like. And they went through, and just based upon what they found in skeletal remains and all these kinds of things, and they put out, I think, in papers and magazines all over the world. This is what they came up with that Jesus might have looked like. Now, I have a feeling this is not what you picture whenever you picture Jesus in your mind. And again, this is not saying that's what he did look like. But according to this passage, there was nothing in him to attract us to him. And he could have easily looked like that. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have had that clueless of a look on his face. But that's what he might have looked like. But the problem was when he showed up and they said there was nothing in him to attract us to him. We all think he looks like this. That's when you go to the next picture. I try to show the cue. I'm sorry. Yeah. That's Obi-Wan Kenobi, okay. Now, where we got this was that this is taking a picture on Facebook. Apparently, there was a guy's grandma that actually has this on her mantelpiece, and it is Ewan McGregor who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, and she does think it's Jesus, okay? And it went viral, and I don't even think she knows it's gone viral, and I feel sorry for her, even though I'm using it today on Christmas and making it go even more worldwide, okay? Sorry, Grandma, okay. We all think he looks like that, but he apparently didn't. Because that's what it would have attracted us to him. Now think about this. They said he wasn't as we pictured him. Scholars say that in ancient times especially, because the average height would have been much shorter than it is today, that if people were tall and had a bearing and stature, they were viewed as the king type. And they wanted their kings to be tall and kind of, LeBron James kind of build, which, it wasn't just ancient times, right? But there is a belief that Jesus was probably much the opposite. The early church actually taught that he would have been ugly to the point of deformity. And I don't know if that's true or not. But in other words, his stature, some of you who are short and kind of deal with that kind of stuff, Jesus perhaps might have been short compared to the average person and walked around. In other words, he had nothing that you pictured until he opened his mouth, until he reached out his hand. Now, that's important to note, because I know some of you have maybe in our beauty-associated society have maybe been struggling your whole life with body shaming and things of that nature. Think about this. The Bible says that Jesus resurrected in his body that he died on the cross with. It was an empty tomb, so he came back in his body. That means the King of the universe, the Messiah, is going to be someone that if you were to look at him, throughout eternity, if you were to look at him, you wouldn't associate his physical stature or his beauty with anything great. The King of the universe decided to do things that way. And I think that's telling, and I think it's helpful, and I think it's one of those things that ought to attract us to him, because God looks upon the things of the heart before he looks on the externals. He had nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. The final thing I want you to observe from this passage is the subject of substitution. Substitution. Now, before we go back to the Isaiah passage, what I want to do is I want to read the Christmas story as it's recorded in Matthew. And then I want to go back to Isaiah and read and have you look at the Christmas story through the grid of what Isaiah has reported. But here's what the book of Matthew says about Jesus being born. It says, this is how the birth of Jesus and the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was a man faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. You would need a dream from heaven to believe that. Then listen to what the angel says. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save the people from their sins. You're going to give him the name Jesus, and his name is Jesus is because there's a reason given by it. He will save the people from their sins. Now, the name Jesus is just the Greek form of the Jewish name Yeshua, or we say it Joshua. And it means the Lord saves. So he's saying, you're going to give him the name Jesus because his entire title, his entire identification, when it all comes down to it, he's not going to be the best looking guy, he's not going to be the tallest guy, but what he's going to be, his most fundamental mission, who he is he's going to save people from their sins. It goes back to the whole thing with shadows and all the rest, is to not only just let us know that Jesus is the point of the Bible, but what the point of Jesus is. And I can say this, guys, as I've gone personally back through the shadows, we looked at everything from the tabernacle and the temple and the sacrifices and the Passover meal and all the different things that we did. And when it comes to shadows, one of the things that it just drilled down in me heavier than ever in my life is this idea of substitution is number one. Jesus came to do a lot of things, and he did a lot of very important things. And it's not that other things weren't important, but the most important task that he had to do was to save the people from their sins. Save the people from their sins. Now, with that in mind, I want you to hear Isaiah 53, 4 through 6. Continuing on from where we just were a minute ago. Surely he took our pain. He bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. But the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now here's the problem. Based on the shadow, and it's very, very clear what the point of Jesus' life was. Based on the Christmas story, it's very, very clear all the way down to his name what the point of Jesus' life was. In our modern collective way of thinking, we're not very attracted by that idea, and we don't give it a lot of credibility. What I mean by this, did you hear the word sin in the Christmas story? He will save them from their sins. And throughout this passage in Isaiah, you hear transgressions and iniquities. Transgressions, iniquities, sins. It's mentioned all the time, but we don't talk that way anymore. We've almost lost those categories. And here it is, the most important subject that Jesus came to do. And what we have to do is, because the danger that we all face is that today, Christmas especially, Christmas got a lot of ceremony about it, and there's songs, and there's lights, and there's all these things. It is easy to turn who Jesus is and what he's about into a ceremony, where we just hear these words, and we just think of them conceptually, and we just kind of go, yeah, that's a nice thing, and I felt real good, and I really like that one song, and then we go out and say Merry Christmas. But what I want to challenge us to do is not only see that Jesus was predicted as the exalted one who was humiliated, not only see him as the rejected one, but to see him as the substitution and truly get in touch with the most important thing he did. And sometimes you have to work at it. Think about sin, transgression, and iniquity. Merry Christmas. Think about those things. What are they? Well, all of us carry with us in it. We know this. Even though we don't use the terms and we've even dismissed the concept, we all know this happens. Inside of each of us, there's this little gauge. It's what we ought to do. There's a perception of what we ought to do. And there's a perception of what we ought not to do. You go through a drive-thru, and you buy your burger and fries and your drink and all that, and someone follows up by saying, oh, would you like to donate to St. Jude's Children's Hospital? You got that one? And then you go through this little thing. I know what I ought to do. I ought to care about children. I ought to be generous. And some of you follow through with it. Some of you kind of, slink away, kind of guilty feeling. That happens. This is a simple thing. There's this ought to do thing. And on the opposite side, we have a list of things that we know we ought not to do. And that's where secretly we know that we lie, we color the truth, we exaggerate to make our stories sound a little better than they really are. We tell our wives that we're working late, but really we're just kind of drinking in internet porn. We fill our lives with iniquities. We have all these shortcomings we know, and we step over those lines. We have it on both ends, right? Now with that comes this very natural thing, that at some point in our perceptions that you can not do the right things enough or commit the wrong things enough that you deserve some kind of pushback, some kind of punishment, some kind of something. This gets affirmed over and over and over again in our society all the time, and it's a good thing. It's called justice. I don't know if you saw this or not, but there's a 95-year-old former guard of a Nazi prison camp that they busted and they sent him back to Germany just recently. And I read that this has happened a little over 20 times in the last couple of years because they're surfacing. And one of the prosecutors said, I don't care how old these guys are. Justice ought to be served. We've mentioned in here Larry Nasser, who's the doctor with the U.S. gymnastics team and who sexually abused over 150 girls. And the judge in that trial where he was busted is kind of getting in trouble now because they felt like she stepped over the line because she was so incensed. She went ahead and talked about justice, and you're going to pay, and she cracked that gavel. And we all know in some ways we kind of sympathize with her because we're like, yes, because if she were to say something like, well, Larry, or you promise never to do this again? Do you feel bad for what you did? Okay, it's fine. We all have that sense. Now, here's what we do in our minds, though. We have this little territory. Here's what I ought to do. Here's what I ought not to do. And I'm going to stay in this territory by my own perceptions so that I don't get to a place where I deserve punishment. Here's how we do it. Many times we do it by comparison. We compare ourselves with others. Well, I'm no Nazi. I'm not Larry Nasser. So I'm in the zone. Sometimes we do it through justification. I bought my cheeseburger and my fries and my Coke, but money's been kind of tight. I'm in kind of a hurry. I know I ought to be generous, but here's the trick. We think of ourselves of having taken care of the problem that way. We keep ourselves within the good zone by our own perceptions. Now, let me ask you something. You ever had anybody in your life that you worked with, lived with, sitting next to, that you really can't understand why they can't see just how self-centered they're being? Why can't they see this flaw? They walk into work every day and drive me crazy because of this thing, and everybody can see it except them. You have anybody like that in your life? Don't say a word. You know what they're doing? You know what? They don't see it. The same reason you don't. Because they've got that, they keep themselves in the zone through comparison. They keep themselves in the zone through justification. And even if they were confronted about here's why I do what drives you absolutely crazy. Here's why I look so self-centered. That's the cliche within a marriage. It's very easy to see how self-centered someone else is being. You ever notice that? But you're the last person to see how self-centered you're being. But we all acknowledge. Here's what I love about the Isaiah passage. Did you hear the kind of words it used? He has laid on him the iniquity of us all, our sin. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. The most basics of what Jesus came to do was to set people free and save them from their sins. How did he do it? How did he do it? And he said in the Garden of Gethsemane and all the way through the Old Testament, there was no other way. There was one. It was substitution, what theologians call substitutionary atonement. And it means that you do color outside the lines. You may not see it, and you can't understand why people don't see theirs. But God's announcing to all of us as humankind, I see yours. I see it all the time. And you think I don't because you hide behind justification and comparison all the time. You do it. But I see as bankrupt it is. Get rid of that plan. It's a bad plan. The plan is supposed to be, I know I have it coming. I know I do. And I can acknowledge there's selfishness that I'm not even aware of in myself. There's iniquities that I've committed that I won't even know until I'm standing before the judge. And I need a substitute. Why? For the same reason that we said a while ago, the judge, Larry Nassar, wouldn't be considered a very good judge. He wouldn't be considered to do the right thing if she were just to let off and just kind of treat it with a hand wave. And it's the same way with God. And he says, listen, what substitution does is it fully acknowledges what you deserve so richly, but at the same exact time gives it to someone else so you can be free. It's the most beautiful message in the world. And it's the message that all of the Bible was leading up to. And at this Christmas, as we're getting ready to go and receive communion, it's acknowledging that reality. Because when you take the cup and you take the bread, you know what you're saying? You're saying, that is my food, that is my drink. I had to have a substitute. And those of you who have received that substitute, just be reminded of it today at this Christmas season. His name will be Jesus because he will save the people from their sins. But for those of you who have never come to him, you want to stay on the plan of justification and comparison? You're warned it doesn't work and it's not going to work. But all you have to do today is say, put me in the we, put me in the hour. I want to be substituted for. Receive it today to say, God, place that on me. And then for those of you who don't accept that, at least think about it. At least consider it thought-provoking and an idea that you're willing to consider and ask about and everything else. But I would also ask you to respectfully and quietly, no one's going to make a big deal out of this, just abstain. Just kind of hold off and use the quiet time that we have to think about, why don't I believe it and what answers do I need to get to the questions that I have. At this point, what I'm going to ask to do is that we're going to have service leaders at each of our campuses are going to come up and they're going to guide you through a time of communion. So I'm going to go to our campuses at this point.